I sat in front of the computer screen, the office light casting a pale glow on my face. My eyes were glued to the monitor, where the words from an email danced before me like a nightmare I couldn't escape. 3 days before my 32nd birthday, Garrett forgot to log out of our shared email account. Something he hadn't done in 6 years of marriage. I only intended to print out the electric bill, but instead the subject line of an email titled, "This Weekend," froze every sense in my body. "Can't wait for the weekend. Once she's out of the way, we won't have to sneak around anymore," read the words from Bianca, each one a knife plunging straight into my heart. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the keyboard, opening the full conversation. A string of emails spanning 2 years unraveled before me. Photos taken in hotel rooms where I thought Garrett was on business trips. Restaurant receipts from places I had never set foot in. And then there were pictures of Bianca, in a red silk nightgown. The same one I had seen in Garrett's suitcase when he said it was a gift for his sister. Turns out I had made a fool of myself without even knowing. Cold sweat soaked through the back of my shirt as I hit the forward button, sending every email to the personal account Garrett didn't know I had. Evidence piled up, line by line, like the mocking laughter of betrayal. "I'll tell her after her birthday. Once she has nowhere to go, it'll be easier," Bianca wrote. And Garrett replied, "Perfect, it'll be the most unforgettable birthday of her life." I slammed the laptop shut, my hands clenched so tightly that my knuckles turned white. No more tears. Nothing left to cry about. The front door creaked open, the sound of keys rattling in the lock. Garrett was home. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand and walk to the living room. He stepped inside with a wide grin, his shirt wrinkled and the stench of alcohol hitting my nose. "Babe, you're still up?" Garrett dropped his bag to the floor and moved closer. "Just tidying up a few things," I said, forcing a tight smile. "Ooh, big meeting tomorrow, so I had to work late," he said, leaning in to kiss my forehead. His breath reeked of alcohol and perfume I never wore. I just smiled. "Work must be exhausting." "Yeah, but after your birthday, I promise I'll make more time for you," Garrett said, his eyes gleaming as though he actually believed his own lie. In that moment, all I wanted was to scream, to slap that smug look off his face. But instead, I just smiled, pretending everything was fine. "I'll be waiting," I said, my fingers gripping the hem of my sweater so tightly that the fabric nearly tore. Garrett didn't know that I knew. Didn't know that I had seen everything. Didn't know that this birthday would indeed be the most unforgettable one of my life. But not in the way he planned. I returned to the office, sat down at the desk and opened the laptop. The dark words from the emails filled the screen again. I logged out of his account and opened mine. Every piece of evidence was there. Every message, every photo, every deceitful promise. I moved the cursor to the save button and clicked hard. In that moment, I made my decision. Garrett wanted this birthday to be the day I was erased? Fine, I'd make it the day I erased him from my life forever. The morning of my 32nd birthday began with sunlight streaming through the blinds, illuminating the pale blue dress I'd picked out the night before. Part of me wanted to rip it to shreds and throw it away, but I had to play the role of the naive wife just a little longer. Garrett was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a beaming smile, the smile I once loved but now only found terrifyingly fake. "Happy birthday, babe!" Garrett kissed my cheek, his eyes sparkling as though he was the perfect husband. "I've got something special planned for today." "Oh, really?" I forced a smile, raising the coffee mug to my lips, hiding the tremor in my hands. "What's so special?" "Oh, you'll find out soon," Garrett winked, then stepped into the living room to grab his phone and quickly sent a text. I watched him, my stomach twisting in knots. I knew exactly who he was texting. The woman who had stolen my husband's kisses, hugs, and empty promises. The clock struck 11 when the doorbell rang. I opened it to see Dean and Victor, Garrett's best friends, standing there, each holding a bottle of champagne and flashing mischievous grins. "There she is, the birthday girl!" Dean slapped my shoulder, his eyes darting to Garrett standing behind me. "Ready for a day to remember?" "Completely ready," I said, forcing a smile. "Come on, we got a blindfold her," Victor chuckled, pulling a black silk scarf from his pocket. Garrett took the scarf, stepped closer and said, "This is part of the surprise, Valentina." I closed my eyes as the scarf tightened around my head. Darkness enveloped me. But I could still hear their laughter. Dean's cheap cologne mixed with the stench of booze stung my nose. "Absolutely no peeking," Garrett whispered into my ear, his voice slightly shaky. "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was pounding like a drum. They guided me outside, a hand pressing down on my shoulder, nudging me forward. I felt gravel under my shoes, heard the car door open and the engine roar to life. "All right, birthday girl, sit tight," Victor said, pushing me down into the back seat. The car doors slammed shut, the engine revved and the vehicle sped off, faster than usual. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to sound innocent. "Oh, just a little surprise," Garrett replied. Beside me, Victor and Dean continued to laugh, making vague references to a special gift I was about to receive. "This gift will make sure you never forget this birthday, Valentina," Dean said, cackling, his laughter echoing through the confined space of the car. I counted every second, every turn, every unfamiliar sound outside. The road grew quieter, the car noises faded, and the silence became eerie. Finally, the car came to a stop. Garrett opened the door and I was yanked out. My legs trembled as they touched the ground, feeling the rough surface and smelling the strong odor of gasoline lingering in the air. "All right, ready for your special gift?" Garrett asked, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Absolutely ready," I said, keeping my voice calm. The silk scarf was pulled away from my eyes. Blinding light forced me to squint, but as my vision cleared, I saw where they had brought me. An abandoned gas station, its windows shattered, rusted signs swaying in the wind. Not a soul in sight, not a car passing by. "Surprised?" Dean burst into laughter, waving his hand toward the shattered glass doors. "This is where you're going to spend your birthday, Valentina?" Victor leaned against the car, sipping from a bottle, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Garrett thinks you need some time to reflect on everything." Garrett stepped closer, face to face with me, his eyes dark and cold. "Happy birthday, Valentina," he said, his voice even but his gaze icy. "Find your own way home, if you can." All three of them turned their backs and walked away, their laughter echoing through the empty air. I stood there, legs trembling, chest heaving like a storm was raging inside me. I watched the car disappear down the road, a cloud of dust rising to obscure the path ahead. They thought they'd pushed me to the edge. But they were wrong. I stood in the middle of the abandoned gas station, my eyes scanning the peeling paint on the walls and the shattered glass scattered across the ground. The wind howled through, carrying the scent of old gasoline and a biting chill. Garrett's car and the taunting laughter of him and his friends had vanished. All that remained was me and the haunting silence. I reached into my pocket, feeling the edges of the phone I had hidden inside the lining. Garrett might think he had taken my phone, but I had prepared a second one, tucked securely in the coat lining since yesterday. I powered it on, took a deep breath, and tapped the only contact I had pre-probed. "Jacob," I said, my voice raspy, "do you remember your offer to help me?" On the other end, Jacob's voice was warm but laced with concern. "Valentina, where are you?" "I've got 10 minutes before Garrett realizes I'm not where he left me," I said, eyes scanning the empty road in front of me. "The abandoned gas station on Raymore Road. I need a car, now." "I'm on my way. 10 minutes," Jacob said before the line went dead. I shoved the phone back into my coat pocket and hurried inside the gas station. Faded posters lay strewn across the floor, and the cracked windows reflected a woman with tangled hair, red eyes, and lips pressed so tightly they'd turned white. Time was running out. The plan had been set in motion last night when I discovered Garrett's special birthday surprise. I kicked off my heels and slipped on the sneakers I'd stashed in my coat pocket. The oversized scarf was wrapped around my shoulders, doubling as both a disguise and a shield against the cold. 10 minutes stretched out like a lifetime. I stepped outside the gas station, eyes locked on the empty road. Every passing car made my heart lurch, but none of them stopped. Then, in the distance, I saw Jacob's familiar gray pickup truck approaching. He pulled up right in front of me, flinging the door open. "Get in," he said, his dark brown eyes scanning me with worry. I climbed into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. "Did you bring everything I asked for?" Jakob nodded, tossing the duffel bag onto the back seat. "Your stuff, cash, and the new phone. Are you sure you want to do this, Valentina?" I clenched my hands on my knees, my fingers digging into my skin. I don't have any other choice. Jacob pressed the gas pedal, and the car sped away from the gas station, heading toward the highway. I glanced back through the rearview mirror, watching the rundown gas station fade behind a cloud of dust. At that moment, my phone vibrated. It was Garrett. "I thought he took my phone," I whispered, pressing the power button and pulling out the battery. Now, I couldn't leave any traces behind. "Where are you going?" Jacob asked, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "First to New York," I said, unzipping the duffel bag and pulling out a bus ticket I had booked 3 days ago. "Then I'll fly somewhere Garrett would never expect." Jacob gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tightening as if he wanted to say something but decided against it. Finally, he spoke. "Are you sure you want to do this alone? Garrett is dangerous. He's not going to let you disappear that easily." "I spent 12 years living under Garrett's shadow," I said, my voice firm even though my heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it. "Now it's time for me to step into the light." Jacob didn't say another word. The car sped through the night, leaving behind empty roads and painful memories I never wanted to return to. Inside my coat pocket, I clutched the gold bracelet, the last gift my mother gave me before she passed away. "Mom, I can do this," I whispered, closing my eyes as the car merged into the crowded city traffic. And I knew, from this moment on, Valentina was gone. The woman sitting in this car, eyes burning with determination, she was going to write her own story. Paris welcomed me with the light drizzle and endless cobblestone streets. The old taxi pulled up in front of a run-down apartment building with peeling walls and balconies covered in overgrown vines. I opened the door, stepped out, and dragged my worn-out suitcase behind me. The apartment I rented was on the 3rd floor. The wooden stairs creaked under each step, the musty smell hitting me as I climbed. The green-painted door screeched as I turned the key. Inside was a small room, just big enough for a single bed, a tiny wardrobe, and a window overlooking the street. I dropped the suitcase on the floor and pulled the new phone from my coat pocket. No missed calls. No messages. No one knew I was here. Valentina Reynolds was gone, along with every memory of Garrett. Now I was Valerie Chent, a lone American woman in the heart of Paris, no family, no friends, no past. The next morning I walked into Lambert Financials, a 4-story office building with gleaming glass windows. The reception desk was situated right in the main lobby, where black suits and high heels clicked across the white tile floors. "Bonjour, madame, I have an interview with Mrs. Lefevre," I said, forcing a confident smile. The receptionist glanced me over, her eyes indifferent. "Waiting room at the end of the hall. Mrs. Lefevre will call you in." I nodded and sat down on a stiff plastic chair. My hands twisted together, my fingers clenched so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. In front of me was a large mirror, reflecting a stranger. My hair was cut short and dyed black. My face was thinner after too many sleepless nights. My eyes were sunken like 2 bottomless pits. The door swung open. A middle-aged woman with her hair tied back stepped out, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Valerie Chen?" "That's me," I said, standing up, taking a deep breath, and following Mrs. Lefevre into her office. Mrs. Lefevre's office was small but organized. Stacks of files lined the desk, and a framed family photo sat neatly beside the computer. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "I see from your file that you previously worked as a receptionist for a real estate firm in New York?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I handled customer service, phone calls, and scheduling appointments." Mrs. Lefevre clasped her hands together, her eyes serious. "How fluent is your French?" "I'm still learning," I said carefully, "but I can manage basic conversations." Mrs. Lefevre raised an eyebrow, saying nothing. Her gaze drifted down to the file in her hand, pausing at the address. "You just moved to Paris, correct?" "Yes, I arrived just last week." She nodded, her eyes softening. "I see. This job is temporary, a 3-month contract. You'll be answering phones, greeting clients, and assisting with filing. If you do well, we'll consider a long-term position." "I'll do my best," I said, forcing a smile even though my heart was pounding. Mrs. Lefevre stood up, extending her hand. "Welcome to Lambert Financial, Valerie." I shook her hand, my palm cold. This wasn't where I expected to end up. This wasn't the job I had once dreamed of. but it was my only chance to start over. At lunchtime, I left the office and slipped into a small cafe down the street. I chose a table by the window, watching people rush by. In my hand was an old newspaper, the front page featuring a story about a car accident in New York. My mind spun. I couldn't stop thinking about Garrett. He'd realize I was gone without a trace. He'd start searching. He'd go crazy, but I had to become a shadow, a person with no name, no past. Valerie? I flinched, looking up. A man stood before me, holding a cup of coffee and a bag of croissants. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his brown hair tousled over his forehead. "Sorry, but I noticed you staring at that newspaper without turning a single page," he said, his blue eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Are you okay?" I was just thinking. "Oh, I'm Leo. I work in IT on the 3rd floor. I saw you at the reception desk this morning," he said, extending his hand. "You must be the new girl?" I shook his hand, my palm still cold. "Valerie, nice to meet you." "Valerie," he repeated, a warm smile on his face. "If you need anything, let me know. Paris can be a lonely place if you don't know anyone." "Thanks," I said, forcing a small smile. But as Leo walked away, I looked at my reflection in the window. Valerie Chen wasn't Valentina Reynolds. And Leo wasn't Jacob. The only person who truly knew who I was. I looked down and flipped the newspaper to the next page. My breath caught when I saw the headline. "Woman missing in New York. Police still searching for Valentina Reynolds." I stuffed the newspaper into my coat pocket, stood up, and hurried out of the cafe, walking fast. The rain outside hadn't stopped. And I still had to keep running. From Garrett, from the past, and from the person I used to be. The days at Lambert Financial passed by in a blur. Every morning I arrived early, made coffee for the office, wiped down the reception desk, and started the day with a forced smile. Even though my job was just answering phones, I couldn't help but steal glances at financial documents, reports, and the strings of numbers running across the computer screens. One afternoon, after everyone had left, I stayed behind to lock up. When I stepped into the storage room to return a file, my eyes caught sight of a stack of old folders on the shelf. All of them were labeled with red tags. Sensitive documents. I didn't intend to look, but one of the files had been pulled halfway out, revealing a page with bank account numbers and wire transfers. One name jumped out at me: Mark Desmond. He was one of Lambert Financial's biggest clients, known for owning several subsidiary companies in Paris. But something was off. The amount of money transferred from Mark Desmond's account was substantial. 2 million euros had been withdrawn over 3 months, with no clear transactions. Everything was labeled under operational expenses. I rushed back to my desk, powered up the computer, and secretly logged into the internal system. My heart raced as my fingers hovered over the latest financial report from Mark Desmond. Every transaction was coded, but I noticed the numbers didn't match the bank statement. The withdrawn funds weren't recorded, and someone was clearly trying to cover it up. I stood up abruptly, eyes fixed on the screen. Someone was embezzling money from Mark Desmond's account. And if I wasn't mistaken, the person handling those transactions was none other than Jean-Luc, the head of finance. The next morning, when I walked into the office, the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Jean-Luc stood by the window, phone in hand, his voice laced with frustration. Monsieur Lefebvre walked past my desk, her eyes avoiding mine. I swallowed hard, knowing I didn't have a choice. I walked up to her office door, took a deep breath, and knocked. "Can I have a minute, Mrs. Lefebvre?" She looked up, her eyes wrinkling. "What is it, Valerie?" I think I found something suspicious in Mark Desmond's financial reports," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "There are large transactions that aren't recorded, and the money is missing from his account." Mrs. Lefebvre was silent for a few seconds. Then she stood up, walked over to the door, and closed it, her eyes stern. "Do you have any proof?" I nodded and placed the file on her desk. "Here are the bank statements and the internal reports from Lambert. 2 million euros disappeared without any legitimate transactions." She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the numbers rapidly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Jean-Luc was the one overseeing these transactions." "I know," I said, forcing myself to remain calm. "But I don't think it was a mistake. Someone's intentionally trying to hide the embezzlement. Mrs. Lefevre looked at me, her eyes suddenly sharp. Do you understand the consequences if you're wrong, Valerie? You're just a receptionist, not an auditor. I understand, I said, my fists clenched so tightly that my knuckles turned white. But I can't stay silent when I see something wrong. Mrs. Lefevre sighed, walking over to the window. She stared outside, where the Paris rain poured down in sheets. If you're right, we're facing a major scandal, and if you're wrong, you're out of a job. I'm willing to take that risk, I said, my voice steady. Mrs. Lefevre turned around, her expression unreadable. All right. I'll look into it, but until the investigation is complete, you are not to mention this to anyone. I nodded, bowed my head, and walked out of her office. My heart pounded in my chest. When I returned to my desk, Jean-Luc's eyes were on me. He was smiling, but it was a cold, sinister smile that sent a chill down my spine. The next day, Lambert Financial was buzzing with the news that Jean-Luc had been suspended pending an investigation. Whispers echoed through the hallways like ghosts passing by. I kept my head down, trying to focus on my work, but my mind was racing. Mrs. Lefevre walked in, her eyes bright with urgency. Valerie, I need to see you in the conference room. When I entered, every eye in the room was on me. Mrs. Lefevre stood next to a tall man with a stern face and piercing eyes. This is Richard Moreau, the CEO of Lambert Financial. He wants to speak with you. Richard Moreau looked at me, his eyes sharp and probing. I understand you discovered discrepancies in Mark Desmond's financial records. Yes, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And you risked losing your job to bring this forward? He asked, his tone calm but cutting. I was just doing the right thing, I replied. Richard's lips twitched into a slight smirk. I think we need to reconsider your position at this company. From now on, you're no longer just a receptionist. I stood there, stunned, unable to speak. It felt like the ground beneath my feet had shifted, propelling me in a completely new direction, a path I never thought I'd take. A week after my promotion, the atmosphere at Lambert Financial remained tense. Jean-Luc was officially terminated, and the embezzlement case involving Mark Desmond was still under investigation. I moved from the reception desk to a small office in administration, just big enough to give me a private space to work. That morning, as I was organizing the messy stack of files on my desk, Mrs. Lefevre walked in. She carried a thick folder, her expression stern. Valerie, you'll be attending the meeting with Richard Moreau and one of our key clients, she said, placing the folder on my desk. I need you to take notes and compile a report after the meeting. Which client? I asked, opening the folder and flipping through the dense pages. Atlantic Meridian Shipping, she replied. Their CEO, Tanner Reed, will be meeting with us in person. This is the most significant deal for our company this year. Don't make any mistakes. Atlantic Meridian Shipping. I had heard of them. A powerful shipping conglomerate with influence not only in Europe but also across the United States and Asia. The name Tanner Reed was unfamiliar to me, but if he was the CEO of such a major corporation, he was undoubtedly someone not to be underestimated. I nodded, trying to hide the rising anxiety. I'll be thoroughly prepared. The meeting took place in the main conference room. The glass wall offered a panoramic view of Paris, shrouded in a thick layer of fog. I sat in a corner seat, notebook ready in my hands. The door swung open. Richard Moreau entered first, followed by a tall man with a stern, cold expression. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, his brown hair neatly combed, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room. Tanner Reed, this is Valerie Chen, our new assistant, Richard introduced. She'll be taking notes and compiling the summary of today's meeting. Tanner turned to me, his eyes showing a flicker of curiosity, but no emotion. He extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Valerie. I shook his hand, trying to keep my voice steady. Pleasure to meet you. His hand was cold but firm. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, but I quickly pulled away and lowered my gaze, focusing on my notes as Richard began his presentation. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Tanner Reed didn't speak much, but whenever he did, his words were sharp and precise, like the edge of a knife. He asked challenging questions about investments, financial risks, and contingency plans. The entire room was tense, and I concentrated on capturing every detail. When the meeting concluded, Richard and Tanner shook hands. "We'll review your proposals and get back to you as soon as possible," Richard said. Tanner nodded, but his eyes lingered on me. "Valerie, may I borrow your notes for a moment?" I hesitated. Of course." I stood up, walked to the table and handed him the notes. Tanner flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning every line. His brow furrowed slightly, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking. "You're very thorough," Tanner said, his deep voice calm. "Have you worked in finance before?" I was just a receptionist and administrative assistant," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Really?" Tanner's lips twitched slightly, his gaze drifting over me as if he were analyzing every detail. "If given the chance, I think you could do more than that." "Thank you," I said, unable to meet his eyes. Tanner handed the notes back, offering a faint enigmatic smile before turning and leaving the room. Once the door closed, I slumped back into my chair, feeling as if I had just survived a battle. I returned to my desk, my eyes unconsciously drawn to the last line Tanner had read. What had I written that caught his attention? I flipped back to the page. And there it was. The investment in the Mediterranean region presents high risks due to recent strikes and political instability. Consider redirecting focus to Northern Europe, where the economy is more stable and less impacted by trade conflicts. I took a deep breath. Was that the note that piqued Tanner's interest? If so, I had unknowingly made an impression, one I hadn't intended to make. That evening, when I left the office, the rain was pouring down. I pulled my coat collar up, walking quickly through the cold downpour. The street lights cast long shadows on the wet pavement. As I stepped off the curb, a black car pulled up in front of me. The window rolled down and I startled when I recognized the familiar face. "Valerie," Tanner Reed said, his voice blending with the sound of the rain. "I was just about to call you." "What can I do for you?" I asked, masking my surprise. "You were right about the Mediterranean investment," Tanner said, his blue eyes dark and intense. "I'd like to hear more of your thoughts. Do you have some time?" I stood frozen in the rain, my heart pounding. It wasn't that Tanner Reed was a powerful CEO. It was the way he was looking at me. As if he could see through every layer I had built around myself. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Paris was no longer a place to run away from my past. It had become the place where I stood firm on my own 2 feet. I had climbed from being an administrative assistant to a financial consultant at Lambert Financial. Tanner Reed, once just a client, had become an integral part of my life. Our relationship developed as naturally as breathing. It began with intense work sessions, late-night meetings, and stressful deadlines. But soon it evolved into long evenings over glasses of wine, sharing stories neither of us had told anyone else. I still hadn't told Tanner about my past. About Valentina Reynolds, the wife abandoned at a deserted gas station on her birthday. One morning, as I sat at my desk, Tanner pushed open the door. He looked different. His expression sharper, more intense than usual. "Valerie, I need you to look at this," Tanner said, placing a thick folder on my desk. I raised an eyebrow and opened the folder. The words jumped off the page. Reynolds Construction, Financial Support Proposal from Atlantic Meridian Shipping. My heart pounded against my ribcage. Reynolds Construction. Garrett Reynolds. He was seeking financial support from Atlantic Meridian? The very company where I now served as a strategic advisor. "I think you should go through this," Tanner said, folding his arms over his chest, his eyes fixed on me. "Reynolds Construction is facing bankruptcy. They're proposing an emergency loan to expand into the European market. I haven't decided whether to meet with them or not." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm. "Have you made a decision yet?" "Not yet," Tanner said, his eyes narrowing. "But I want to know why you reacted the way you did when you saw that name." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. This was the moment I knew I couldn't keep hiding from Tanner. Taking a deep breath, I said, "Reynolds is my ex-husband's last name." Tanner remained silent. I couldn't read his expression. "Ex-husband?" "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. 3 years ago, on my birthday, Garrett Reynolds left me stranded at a deserted gas station. He and his friends called it a joke. A lesson to teach me not to rely on him too much. Tanner's jaw clenched. And you disappeared after that? I never went back, I said, my eyes falling away from the file. I used the little money I had left to leave New York and start over in Paris. I created a new identity, Valerie Chen. The room seemed to freeze. Tanner stood across from me, his blue eyes gleaming with an emotion I couldn't decipher. And now he wants us to save his company? Tanner asked, his voice low and rough. Yes, I said, clenching my fists. He doesn't know who I am now. He still thinks I'm the naive doll he once abandoned. But I'm no longer Valentina Reynolds, and I want to face him, on my own turf. Are you sure? Tanner stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to do this. I can decline right now. No, I shook my head. I want him to see me. To see the woman he threw away. Not the weakling begging him to come back, but the one standing strong as a financial advisor for one of the biggest shipping companies in Europe. Tanner looked at me, his gaze softening yet firm. All right, I'll set up the meeting. But Val, if it gets to be too much... Tanner, I cut him off, eyes cold. I've waited 3 years for this moment. I rebuilt my life from the ashes. Now it's time for Garrett Reynolds to see that I'm no longer the pathetic little Valentina he left behind. Tanner studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I'll notify my team. The meeting will be next week. As Tanner left the room, I stared down at the file on my desk. Garrett Reynolds' name was printed in bold across the cover like a ghost from the past, waiting for me to confront it. 3 years ago, he left me alone in the cold rain, laughing at me like a fool, but now he was the one begging for salvation. And this time, I was the one in control. The Atlantic Meridian conference room was bathed in soft amber light. The silence was so thick that I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Tanner sat at the head of the table, his expression calm, but his eyes never left me. Beside him was Marcus Lang, Atlantic Meridian's legal advisor, who had agreed to attend the meeting to ensure everything remained under control. The door swung open. Garrett Reynolds walked in, followed by Marcus Klein, his financial advisor. Garrett wore a gray designer suit, but I still recognized that familiar figure. His dark brown eyes paused on me for a moment, then passed over as if I were just another piece of furniture in the room. Mr. Reed, Garrett said with a polite smile, extending his hand to Tanner. Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. Tanner nodded, his voice steady. We're always open to hearing proposals from potential partners. I sat up straight, my expression blank, my hand gripping the pen tightly. Garrett still hadn't recognized me. 3 years had changed me too much. My once long dark hair was now cut to shoulder length and dyed caramel. The thick glasses were gone, and most importantly, I was no longer the timid Valentina, trembling under Garrett's cold gaze. Garrett and Marcus began their presentation. They spoke about failed investments, incomplete projects, and mounting debts surrounding Reynolds Construction. Garrett tried to paint a rosy picture of the future, but every word only made his desperation more apparent. With Atlantic Meridian's investment, we'll expand our market to Europe and restructure our entire operational system, Garrett said, his voice steady, as if he'd rehearsed every word. Tanner raised an eyebrow, flipping through the documents. I see loans from various banks piling up. Why not try to recover funds from previous projects instead of seeking more debt? Garrett swallowed, a hint of panic flashing in his eyes. The domestic market is saturated. We need a significant push to break into the international market. Tanner nodded silently, not saying another word. I glanced at Marcus Lang, who was also studying Garrett's every move. Valerie, Tanner suddenly turned to me, his gaze sharp. Any observations? Garrett flinched, his eyes snapping to me. Finally, he acknowledged the woman sitting across from him. His eyes widened, and I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw as he realized who I was. Val, Garrett started, but I didn't let him finish. I'm Valerie Chen, I said coldly, leaning back in my chair. Financial advisor for Atlantic Meridian. We've reviewed your proposal and have a few points that need clarification. Garrett stiffened. His eyes remained locked on me, as if he couldn't believe the woman before him was Valentina, the wife he abandoned without mercy. I have a few questions, I said, keeping my voice even. First, the outstanding debts from 3 years ago remain unpaid. If Atlantic Meridian agrees to invest, do you have a concrete plan for repayment? Garrett remained silent, still staring at me in shock. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to salvage the situation. We believe that with funding from Atlantic Meridian, Reynolds Construction will have the capacity to restructure and repay old debts. Restructure? I arched an eyebrow, a cold smile spreading across my lips. Sounds a lot like how Garrett restructured my life 3 years ago. The room fell silent. Garrett's face went pale, his fists clenching tightly. Valentina, he hissed through clenched teeth. I'm not Valentina anymore, I cut him off, eyes blazing. She died the night you left her, stranded at a deserted gas station. She died when you and your friends laughed and drove away. And now, the woman sitting in front of you is Valerie Chen, a woman who no longer cowers before anyone, especially you. Garrett swallowed hard, sweat glistening on his brow. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to? I let out a cold laugh. So, what will you say when Atlantic Meridian refuses this loan? When Reynolds Construction collapses, and you lose everything? Garrett stammered, his eyes darting from me to Tanner. Mr. Reed, you can't do this to us. We need this loan. Tanner crossed his arms, his blue eyes icy. Valerie is right. Atlantic Meridian doesn't invest in companies that can't pay back their debts. You can't do that. Garrett shot up from his seat, his voice shaking. You don't understand what I've lost. I stood up, staring straight into his eyes. What you've lost? Let me tell you what I lost. I lost 3 years of my life escaping your shadow. I had to rebuild everything from nothing. And now, I will not give you the chance to hurt me again. Garrett looked at me like a drowning man searching for a lifeline. Val, please. We were nothing, I said, turning my back and walking out of the room. I was just a fool who loved the wrong man. As I stepped into the hallway, Tanner followed, his warm hand resting on my shoulder. Are you okay? He asked, his deep voice gentle. I took a deep breath, turning to look at him. I'm fine. I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. Valentina's story is a powerful reminder that we should never let others define our worth. Betrayed and abandoned, she not only rose up but also turned her pain into a driving force to rebuild her life from the ground up. From a disregarded wife to a powerful, independent woman, Valentina's journey shows us that the sweetest revenge isn't bringing down those who wronged us. It's living a life that no longer depends on them. What are your thoughts on Valentina's journey? From a wife left behind to a strong self-made woman? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more inspiring stories.